To understand the Berlin Conference, we must first confront a powerful myth, a myth that has survived textbooks, films, and even modern political discussions. This is the myth of Africa as a dark continent. This phrase did not describe Africa. It described European ignorance, fear, and ambition. Africa was not dark. Africa was not empty. Africa was not waiting to be discovered. By the early 19th century, Africa was a continent filled with organized societies, political authority, long-distance trade networks, diplomacy, and military power. This is not to say that it was perfect. There were conflicts between chiefdoms, and in other cases, the weak were taken over by the strong chiefdoms. There was also the Arabic slave trade in the interior of Africa. That's how the world was at the time. What limited European control was not African weakness, but African geography and disease. For centuries, Europeans struggled to move beyond the coast. Tropical diseases such as malaria, yellow fever, and sleeping sickness killed European settlers at extremely high rates. Dense rainforests, vast river systems, deserts, and mountains further limited movement. Until the invention of quinine in the mid-1800s, Africa remained largely inaccessible to permanent European settlement. Because of this, Africa remained governed by Africans. Africa before the Berlin Conference was politically diverse. There was no single African political system. Instead, there were many systems adapted to environment, culture, and history, as there were many chiefdoms and cultures. In West Africa, the Asante Empire was a highly centralized state. It had a king, a council of chiefs, a national treasury, taxation, and a professional army. Gold production was tightly controlled, and Asante diplomacy extended to European powers along the coast. This was not a loose tribe, it was a state. Further north, the Sokoto Caliphate, founded in 1804, governed millions of people across present-day northern Nigeria and Niger. The Kingdom of Congo had diplomatic relations with Portugal from the 15th century. Kings exchanged letters with European monarchs. Christianity was adopted and adapted locally. Treaties were negotiated, sometimes honored, often violated by Europeans. In East Africa, the Swahili city-states such as Kilwa, Zanzibar, and Mombasa were sophisticated commercial centers. They were governed by merchant elites and connected Africa to the Indian Ocean world. African gold, ivory, iron, and agricultural products flowed east, while Indian textiles, Persian glass, and Chinese porcelain flowed west. In southern Africa, states such as the Zulu Kingdom, Sotho, Tswana, and Rosvi organized military defense, trade routes, and political authority long before European conquest. Africa also contained decentralized political systems. Among the Igbo, power was distributed among councils of elders, age-grade associations, and village assemblies. This was not disorder. It was a form of participatory governance that limited absolute authority. Africa, before colonization, was not ungoverned. It was governed differently. Africa was deeply embedded in global trade centuries before colonization. Across the trans-Saharan trade routes, caravans linked the gold fields of West Africa with North African and Mediterranean markets. Salt, a vital commodity, moved south, while gold, leather, cola nuts, and agricultural products moved north. Along the Indian Ocean, African merchants were part of one of the world's oldest trading systems. Swahili traders acted as intermediaries between African interior markets and Asia. These trade networks existed long before Europeans arrived in large numbers. Africa was not isolated. Africa was connected. The Europeans didn't know it yet. For over 300 years, Europe's primary economic relationship with Africa had been the Atlantic slave trade. Millions of Africans were forcibly removed and transported to the Americas. By the early 19th century, this system began to collapse. Britain abolished the slave trade in 1807 and slavery itself in 1833. France abolished slavery in 1848. The United States formally ended slavery in 1865 after a devastating civil war. This shift is often described as a moral awakening. That is only part of the truth. The deeper reason was economic change. Europe was industrializing. Factories replaced plantations as the engine of wealth. European economies now required raw materials, not enslaved labor overseas. Europe did not stop exploiting Africa. It changed the form of exploitation. Instead of exporting African labor, Europe decided to extract African resources using African labor inside Africa. This shift was described as legitimate commerce. Palm oil replaced enslaved people as the primary export. Rubber, cocoa, cotton, groundnuts, copper, and later diamonds and oil followed. European trading companies moved inland to secure supply chains. Trading posts became economic footholds. This transition laid the foundation for formal colonial rule. The scramble for Africa did not happen earlier because Europe itself had not yet changed enough. By the late 19th century, Europe experienced four major pressures. Factories in Britain, France, Germany, and Belgium required enormous quantities of raw materials. Palm oil was essential for machinery and soap. Rubber and gutta percha became critical as the world was wired with telegraph cables and electricity. Africa was rich in these resources. European factories produced more goods than European consumers could buy. Colonies offered captive markets where European goods could be sold without competition. Germany unified in 1871, Italy shortly after. Both were laid to empire and feared exclusion. Colonies became symbols of greatness even when unprofitable. Banks, trading companies, and investors demanded secure territories protected by military force. Colonial expansion increasingly served corporate interests, not just national governments. By the early 1880s, European competition in Africa became unstable. Nowhere was this more dangerous than in the Congo Basin. King Leopold II of Belgium ruled a small country but had vast ambition. Unable to convince Belgium's parliament to fund colonial expansion, he pursued empire privately. He hired Henry Morton Stanley to explore the Congo River, establish stations, and sign treaties with African leaders. These treaties were often misunderstood or fraudulent. African leaders believed they were agreeing to trade or protection. Leopold treated them as land transfers. At the same time, France, through Pierre Savognon de Brazza, claimed territory on the opposite bank of the Congo River. Portugal, citing old treaties, claimed control of the river's mouth. Three European powers now competed for the same region. The risk of war in Europe became real. To prevent conflict between Europeans, Germany's Chancellor Otto von Bismarck proposed an international conference. Additionally, the backdrop to this conference was rich with exploration fervor. Notably fueled by American explorer Henry Morton Stanley's expeditions through Central Africa, which he chronicled in his best-selling book Through the Dark Continent, The appetite for African territory had reached fever pitch among European elites. They were captivated not only by tales of vast riches, but also by dreams of expanding their empires. The Berlin Conference met from November 1884 to February 1885. 14 countries attended: Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, Italy, Spain, the Netherlands. The United States attended as an observer. No African leaders were invited. The General Act of Berlin can be seen as the formalization of the scramble for Africa that was already in full swing. The conference contributed to ushering in a period of heightened colonial activity by European powers, and is sometimes cited as being responsible for the carve-up of Africa. The history of the Berlin Conference is not as straightforward as one may think. Some scholars warn against overstating its role in the colonial partitioning of Africa, drawing attention to the many bilateral agreements concluded before and after the conference. A 2024 study found that the only borders set at the conference were those of the Congo region, and these were subsequently revised, and that most of Africa's borders did not take their final form until over 2 decades later. However, the majority of the scholars indicate that Africa was discussed as territory, not as nations or peoples. In European international law at the time, Africa was treated as terra nullius, land belonging to no one, despite being home to tens of millions of people. This legal fiction made conquest acceptable. There is a general consensus that the conference did not immediately divide Africa. Instead, it created rules that accelerated conquest. That seems undisputable. Here was a pivotal rule. A European power could only claim territory if it physically controlled it through administration, military presence, and economic activity. This rule encouraged violence. European governments now felt compelled to send armies inland, conquer territory, and raise flags before rivals arrived. The Congo and Niger rivers were declared open to international trade. African control over major waterways was eliminated. The Congo Free State was recognized as the personal property of King Leopold II. This decision would have catastrophic consequences. Leopold's Congo was not a Belgian colony. It was a corporate state owned by one man. Global demand for rubber exploded in the late 19th century. Leopold transformed the Congo into a forced labor rubber economy. Villages were assigned quotas. Women were taken hostage to force men into the forest. Failure to meet quotas resulted in punishment. The Force Publique, Leopold's private army, enforced the system through beatings, executions, village burnings, and mutilation. Severed hands became proof that bullets had not been wasted. Missionaries and diplomats eventually exposed the system. Investigations by figures such as Roger Casement and journalists such as E.D. Morel revealed mass death. Between 8 and 10 million people died through murder, starvation, disease, and displacement out of an estimated 20 million, which was half of the population of Congo. The Congo Free State became one of the first modern examples of a crime against humanity, made legal by international agreement. The United States attended the Berlin Conference but chose not to claim territory. America focused on internal expansion and economic influence rather than formal empire. However, this did not mean neutrality. The United States was the first nation to recognize Leopold's Congo. American businesses traded African resources without governing responsibilities. This approach economic penetration without direct rule became a lasting feature of American engagement with Africa. Between 1885 and 1910, European powers carved Africa into colonies. Others were protectorates. A colony is a territory directly governed and owned by a foreign power, with little to no internal autonomy, while a protectorate retains its own internal government and some sovereignty, but cedes control over external affairs, defense, foreign policy to a larger protecting state, often through a treaty. Think of it as a colony being possessed, while a protectorate remains an independent state under another country's protection. Borders were drawn with rulers on maps, not with knowledge of African societies. Ethnic groups were split across colonies. The Yoruba were divided between British and French rule. The Somali were divided into 5 colonial territories. The Yu were split between Britain and France. At the same time, rival groups were forced into single political units. Mountains, rivers, and trade routes were ignored. Straight lines became national borders. These borders became post-independence states, carrying tension into the modern era. Colonial infrastructure was designed for extraction, not development. Railways ran from mines to ports. Roads served plantations. Ports served European shipping. Colonial taxation forced Africans into cash crop farming to earn European currency. Food production declined. Dependency increased. Colonial economies exported raw materials and imported finished goods, a structure that persists today. Africans resisted colonization across the continent. Samurai Touré fought French expansion for nearly 20 years. The Maji-Maji Rebellion united communities against German forced labor. The Herero and Nama resisted German rule in present-day Namibia. The Zulu Asante and many others fought colonial armies. In 1896, Ethiopia defeated Italy at the Battle of Adwa, preserving independence and inspiring black resistance movements worldwide. African resistance was widespread, organized, and costly. Modern African conflicts often trace their roots to Berlin. Colonial states were designed for control, not governance. When independence came, African leaders inherited extractive economies, artificial borders, and security forces designed for repression. Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana's first president, famously called for a united Africa with the declaration, "We must unite now or perish," at the 1963 OAU founding in Addis Ababa. He advocated for a United States of Africa featuring a common defense system, currency, foreign policy, and citizenship to combat neocolonialism and ensure true economic independence. Unfortunately, nationalism at the time was at a fever pitch and United States of Africa never happened. As a result, the conflicts in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan, Nigeria, Somalia, and the Sahel reflect these inherited structures.